The wind howled across the barren expanse of snow and frozen earth, carrying with it the bitter scent of pine and frost. Jackson Cole rode hard, the soles of his boots crunching against the icy ground as his horse's breath fogged in the frigid air. The post-Civil War frontier had turned unforgiving, as if the land itself sought to test the resolve of any soul brave or desperate enough to stake a claim here. Jackson had seen winters like this before, winters that could strip a man down to his bare will, and yet he pressed onward. Each ridge he crossed, each valley he descended, reminded him of the emptiness that had come to define his life. The disease had taken his wife first, then the children. The silence of his cabin had been his only company since. A bitter solitude wrapped around him like the heavy coat he wore, one that had weathered countless storms, yet could never shield the heart from grief. Snowflakes whipped across his face, stinging like tiny needles, but he didn't slow. Something drew him forward, a noise, faint but unmistakable. A soft, ragged groan, almost swallowed by the wind, carried across the frozen plains. Jackson squinted against the blizzard, scanning the white horizon. That's when he saw her, a figure collapsed among the drifts, a shadow against the unyielding whiteness. She lay on her side, barely stirring, her dark hair matted with ice and snow, her body shivering violently in the wind's relentless grip. He hesitated for a heartbeat, the weight of frontier taboos pressing against him. A white man taking in a woman of Apache descent was dangerous, scandalous even, and yet something primal, a human instinct, urged him forward. Jackson dismounted with a grunt, the snow sucking at his boots, slowing his progress. The closer he got, the more he could see the sharp angles of her face, the faint rise and fall of her chest, and the trembling of her fingers, stiff with cold. A wolf howled somewhere distant, and instinctively he tightened his grip on the reins, his eyes scanning the tree line. The wilderness was alive tonight, hunting just as much as he was. He wrapped his coat around her fragile frame, lifting her with a careful strength that belied the tension coiling in his muscles. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, amber orbs wide with fear and defiance, before closing again. Back at the cabin, the fire had dwindled to glowing embers, the smoke curling lazily from the chimney into the storm. Jackson set her gently on the bed he had made after his family's passing, the blankets thick and scratchy but warm. She shivered beneath them, and he could see the faint bruises and cuts along her arms, the remnants of some unseen struggle. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whistling wind. He fetched water from the kettle, setting it on the edge of the table, and watched her chest rise and fall. "You'll live," he muttered, more to himself than to her. His voice sounded foreign in the room, rough and unpracticed in the art of reassurance. She stirred again, and her gaze met his, wary, sharp, and untrusting. Jackson swallowed hard, memories of past failures pressing against the walls he had built around his heart. Trusting anyone had cost him everything once. Yet, here she was alive, vulnerable, and depending on him. The thought was almost unbearable. The storm raged outside, snow piling against the door, howling through gaps in the cabin walls. Jackson moved about methodically, stoking the fire, laying out fresh blankets, checking the rifle he kept near the bed. The frontier had taught him many things. Survival demanded vigilance, courage, and sometimes uncomfortable moral choices. He had known fear before, but the thought of failing this woman, of letting the wilderness claim her, ignited a fire within him that was more powerful than the cold or the wind. Hours passed, the night stretching endlessly. She finally stirred again, this time speaking in a soft, broken English, her words clipped and cautious. "Water! Cold!" she whispered, pointing toward the kettle. Jackson handed it to her, the simplest act of kindness bridging the vast chasm of culture and suspicion between them. Her fingers brushed his, ice-cold and trembling, and he felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the winter. There was a fire in her gaze, though, a quiet strength that belied her current frailty. He learned her name slowly, each word exchanged with painstaking care. Nava, she said, the syllables like a soft wind brushing the canyon walls. She refused to say more at first, and Jackson didn't push. He had learned that patience often spoke louder than words, especially in the silence of the frontier. The night pressed on, hours folding into one another, and Jackson found himself sitting by the fire, rifle across his knees, watching over her as if she were the most fragile ember of all, a life that could be snuffed out in a moment if he faltered. Outside, the blizzard raged with renewed fury, snowdrifts piling higher against the cabin walls. Jackson's horse pawed at the ground, restless in the night, ears flicking at every distant sound. Wolves circled near the tree-line, unseen but ever present, and the wind carried whispers of danger that only the wilderness could speak. Jackson's mind wandered to the path that had led him here. The relentless winters, the solitude, the losses that had hardened him, and now, this unexpected responsibility. He had known hardship. He had endured it, survived it. But this was different. This was not survival for himself alone. He sat quietly, listening to the storm, listening to her shallow breathing, and wondered how the fragile threads of fate had twisted to place them together. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something dangerous, something human, hope. The snow continued to fall, silent and relentless, covering tracks and hiding dangers alike. And yet, within the small circle of warmth in his cabin, amidst the crackle of firewood and the quiet rise and fall of her chest, Jackson Cole understood something vital. The frontier was cruel, but it was also a place where unexpected alliances were forged, and perhaps even redemption could be found. The morning came pale and fragile, a weak sun barely piercing the thick veil of clouds. Snow still lay heavy on the roof, and drifts pressed against the cabin door. Jackson moved quietly, careful not to wake Nava, though he knew she could see him. Her amber eyes followed his every movement, cautious and calculating. There was no fear in her gaze now, only a wariness that mirrored his own. She had survived the storm, but her body still trembled, and Jackson could see the faint bruising along her arms and shoulders. He prepared a simple breakfast, hard bread, a small portion of salted meat, and tea brewed over the fire. She watched him, silent, hands folded in her lap. Every motion he made was measured, deliberate, feeding the fire, chopping more wood, checking the rifle. He felt her eyes on him, and though the words were unspoken, he understood the question she posed. "Can you be trusted?" Jackson sat across from her, sliding a piece of bread toward her on the wooden table. She hesitated, then took it, biting carefully, eyes never leaving his. Silence stretched, unbroken but not uncomfortable. It was a language both understood, the quiet acknowledgement of survival and the tentative bridging of trust. "You hurt?" he asked finally, his voice rough but steady. Nava's lips pressed together, then she nodded faintly. Jackson's hands itched to inspect the bruises, to ensure she was truly unharmed, but he restrained himself. Respect, he had learned, was often shown in what one refrains from doing as much as in actions taken. She watched him carefully, reading his restraint, his patience. The day moved slowly, but the harsh reality of the frontier would not wait. Jackson guided her in small tasks, stacking firewood, mending torn blankets, checking the livestock tethered near the cabin. She moved with surprising grace despite her lingering weakness, her eyes sharp, scanning the horizon as if assessing dangers invisible to him. "You stay," she said, her accent thick but clear as she pointed to the cabin. "Safe here." Jackson nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Safe for now," he said, and there was a weight in his tone that acknowledged the fragile truce with a world beyond these walls. By mid-afternoon, the storm's remnants had passed, leaving the frontier deceptively calm. Snow muffled every sound, yet Jackson knew this peace was temporary. Bandits roamed these lands, drawn to isolated homesteads and vulnerable travelers. The Apache tribes themselves were wary of settlers like him, their eyes and arrows always calculating, always cautious. He had faced danger before, but the combined uncertainty of hostile men and untamed wilderness made his jaw tighten. He showed Nava the rifle, demonstrating how to aim, how to brace herself, though she barely nodded, already alert to every sound outside the cabin. She was a mystery, a fierce survivor shaped by a life he could scarcely imagine. Yet her presence brought a strange warmth to the cabin, a quiet challenge to the emptiness that had dominated his life. Night came, and with it, shadows long and distorted by firelight. Jackson kept watch while Nava slept, a blanket draped over her shoulders. He heard the faint crunch of boots in the snow, the distant whisper of voices, the unmistakable scent of smoke drifting from somewhere beyond the ridge. Bandits. His pulse quickened, muscles tensing. He had faced men like these before, cruel, desperate, unbound by law, but now the stakes were personal. He roused Nava gently. "Bandits," he whispered. She didn't panic. Her eyes sharpened, and she moved beside him with fluid ease, grabbing a knife from the table. Together, they checked the doors, the windows, and the perimeter of the cabin. They didn't speak much. Words were unnecessary. Their movements, precise and synchronized, were communication enough. Jackson marveled at her skill, the way she anticipated threats, the way her presence filled the room with a quiet authority. Hours stretched, tension coiling like a spring ready to snap. The bandits never came close enough to see them, perhaps deterred by the cabin's fortifications or the unknown force of the pair inside. Jackson exhaled, muscles relaxing only slightly, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared feel since his family's death: hope. In the quiet that followed, he and Nava returned to their chores, sharing silence that felt more like conversation than any words could. He watched her clean the rifle, her fingers steady, precise, each motion a testament to a life forged in constant vigilance. He realized then that she was not simply a survivor. She was a warrior, tempered by hardship and yet unbroken. "You trust?" she asked finally, looking up from the rifle, eyes piercing. Jackson hesitated. Trust had been a luxury he hadn't allowed himself for years. Yet, here she was, alive because of him, yet demanding nothing more than acknowledgement. He nodded. "I do," he said, and he meant it, though the words felt foreign on his tongue. The day waned, and they moved outside together, surveying the livestock and the snowbound pasture. Jackson taught her how to check for frozen water troughs, how to secure the animals against wolves, how to read the subtle signs of the land. She learned quickly, her gaze always alert, her hands deft. In moments like these, their silence was comfortable, the mutual reliance palpable. By nightfall, the cabin was once more bathed in the warm glow of firelight. They ate in quiet companionship, each lost in their own thoughts. Jackson could feel the weight of her gaze at times, studying him, measuring him, weighing him. And though he had long sworn off human connection, he found himself drawn to her presence, not only for survival, but for something deeper, something the frontier had denied him for too long. The storm outside whispered of dangers yet unseen, of the wild world beyond the cabin walls. Yet, within, an uneasy alliance had formed, a bond of necessity and mutual respect. Jackson Cole, a man broken by grief, had found in Nava not only a life to protect, but a reflection of his own resilience. And Nava, fierce and proud, had discovered that even in the cold, unyielding frontier, trust could be kindled, fragile as it might be. The night stretched on, silent but heavy with unspoken questions. What would the dawn bring? Would the world allow this fragile truce to survive, or would danger breach the cabin walls? Jackson didn't know, and Nava didn't speak of it. They simply watched the fire, each aware that survival was only the first step, and that trust, like the land itself, had to be earned day by day, storm by storm. And in that quiet, flickering glow, the seeds of something extraordinary began to take root, unspoken but undeniable, promising a journey that neither had anticipated but both could no longer ignore. Snow swirled across the ridge, the pale morning light barely illuminating the tree lane. Jackson had barely slept, Every distant crack of ice, every gust of wind felt like an omen. He had patched the cabin walls, reinforced the doors, and double-checked the rifle's chamber, yet nothing could prepare him for what came next. A shadow moved against the horizon, figures, unmistakably men, approaching with the deliberate caution of predators. Bandits. Nava sensed it first. Her body tensed, and without a word, she crouched beside the door, hand resting on the knife at her belt. Jackson felt the same tension coil in his stomach, but he remained calm outwardly, letting the years of frontier survival guide him. The first shot rang out before either could speak, and the snow around the cabin erupted in chaos. Jackson fired, his movements precise, each shot deliberate. Nava was already in motion, sliding to the side, her bow drawn, an arrow nocked with lightning speed. A bullet struck the wood near her shoulder, splintering the cabin wall, but she moved as if in slow motion, letting the arrow fly and embedding it with deadly accuracy in the approaching bandit's chest. Jackson's breath came fast, adrenaline fueling each motion, muscles responding instinctively. They were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for each other, their bond unspoken but unmistakable. Outside, the snow became a blur, whipping against their faces, freezing the sweat on Jackson's brow. Wolves howled from the tree-line, drawn by the commotion, circling, their eyes glinting. Jackson felt the pull of instinct, firearm in hand. He fought off both human and animal threats. Nava moved beside him, fluid and relentless, her amber eyes locked on each target, her movements precise. She was no longer merely a survivor. She was a force. The cabin walls shook with gunfire and splintering wood. Jackson ducked, rolled, and returned fire. A bandit lunged through a broken window, and Nava's knife met him mid-step, a silent testament to her lethal skill. Jackson's heart pounded, each beat marking the rhythm of life and death. In moments like these, words were useless. Only action mattered. Hours or perhaps minutes, for time had lost all meaning, passed in a relentless storm of snow, gunfire, and survival. Jackson felt exhaustion creeping in, the weight of responsibility pressing on him like the snow piled against the cabin walls. And yet, each glance at Nava reminded him why he fought, not just for his own life, but for hers. For the first time in years, he felt a purpose that transcended mere survival. Finally, the last bandit fell, a collapse into the snow that echoed against the hills. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. Jackson and Nava leaned against the cabin wall, chests heaving, bodies slick with sweat and snow. They didn't speak immediately. There were no words sufficient for the intensity of what had just passed. "You alive?" Nava said finally, her voice low, hoarse yet steady. Jackson nodded, chest still heaving. "Thanks to you," he admitted. His voice carried the weight of genuine respect, of acknowledgement. She met his gaze, and in that look, 100 unspoken thoughts passed between them. Gratitude, relief, and the unbreakable bond forged in shared danger. The night returned, bringing with it a quiet that felt almost unreal after the chaos. Jackson inspected the cabin, tallying damage and losses. The walls bore new scars, windows splintered, the door partially torn. Outside, the snow had settled once more, pristine and indifferent, as if the battle had never occurred. Yet inside, the cabin held 2 survivors who had faced death together and emerged not just alive, but irrevocably changed. Nava moved to the fire, brushing snow from her hair, and Jackson noticed for the first time the subtle shift in her demeanor. She was no longer just wary or guarded. She trusted him, trusted herself, trusted the fragile safety they had carved together from the merciless frontier. Jackson, in turn, felt the walls around his heart crumble further, a slow erosion catalyzed by shared struggle and undeniable respect. As they settled near the fire, Jackson offered her food, which she accepted without hesitation. They shared silence once more, the kind that spoke louder than words. Then, almost imperceptibly, Nava placed her hand atop his, a small gesture, yet one heavy with meaning. It was trust, acknowledgement, a recognition that whatever came next, they faced it together. The night stretched, shadows flickering across the cabin walls, their faces half-lit by fire. Jackson spoke softly, more to himself than her. "We made it," he said. She nodded, a slight curve of her lips, and for a fleeting moment, Jackson allowed himself to believe in something beyond mere survival. But the frontier demanded vigilance. Wolves circled closer now, their eyes glinting in the dim light. Jackson grabbed the rifle, Nava at his side, and together they scanned the treeline. The world outside was still perilous, indifferent, and merciless, but they had proven their mettle. Together, they could endure. Jackson finally allowed himself a small smile, rare and fleeting. "We'll need to reinforce the cabin," he said. "Storms aren't finished with us yet." Nava merely nodded, her eyes glowing with quiet determination. They moved to work together, stacking wood, patching windows, and securing the cabin against future threats. Every motion, every shared task, further cemented the bond that had grown between them, born of survival, respect, and something more tender, more human, that neither dared name yet. Hours later, the fire burned low, casting a golden glow across the cabin's interior. Jackson watched Nava rest, her body finally at ease after the long day of action and vigilance. He realized something profound. She had become his anchor in a world that had offered nothing but loss and solitude. And in that realization, he understood a truth he had long denied himself. Human connection, trust, and courage could bloom even in the harshest winters, even amidst the most relentless danger. Outside, the storm whispered of future trials, but inside, there was warmth, companionship, and the quiet acknowledgement of a bond forged in the crucible of survival. Jackson Cole, once a man defined by grief and solitude, and Nava, fierce and unyielding, now shared a partnership that transcended survival. A partnership of mutual respect, reliance, and the first fragile seeds of something far deeper. The night held them in its still embrace, but Jackson knew that dawn would bring new challenges. Other men, the unyielding wilderness, and the relentless test of trust. Yet he no longer feared these trials alone. Nava was beside him, an ally, a confidant, and perhaps something more. And together, they would face whatever the frontier demanded. The dawn crept over the horizon like a slow, cautious promise, pale light spilling over snow-laden hills and broken trees. Jackson stood at the cabin door, surveying the winter-stricken land, his breath curling in the frigid air. The battle from the previous night had left its mark. The door hung crooked, splintered would littered the yard, and tracks in the snow told the tale of retreating bandits. But amidst the wreckage, a fragile victory remained. He and Nava had endured. Nava emerged from the cabin, wrapped in a thick blanket, her hair tousled and damp from the condensation of early morning frost. Her amber eyes met his, steady, unflinching, yet softened with something that startled him, warmth. She had survived the night, but more than that, she had chosen to remain here, at his side, in this desolate place that had known nothing but loss and solitude. Jackson's chest tightened with unspoken emotion. The frontier had been cruel to him, robbing him of family, peace, and hope. Yet, here she was, a living testament that even in the harshest of lands, connection could be forged, not through comfort, but through shared trials and unwavering courage. "We survived," he said, his voice low, roughened by exhaustion and years of isolation. Nava nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon, always alert. "We live," she corrected softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength. There was no need for embellishment. This simple acknowledgement was enough. The morning passed in a quiet rhythm of repairs and preparation. Jackson worked with Nava to mend the cabin, stack firewood, and secure the livestock. Each movement was deliberate, each glance shared, a silent language that had grown between them over days of peril and survival. Jackson found himself speaking less and watching more, noticing the way she moved, the way she handled the world with quiet authority. There was a grace in her vigilance, a sharpness that reminded him of the dangers outside, and a resilience that mirrored his own inner strength. By mid-afternoon, the repairs were sufficient to withstand the remainder of the winter. They stood together outside the cabin, surveying their work, shoulders brushing occasionally, each aware of the other's presence in a way that had nothing to do with necessity. The silence between them was comfortable, charged with understanding, respect, and something unspoken yet undeniable. Nava turned toward him, her gaze unwavering. "You trust me," she said, a statement more than a question, the words carefully measured, her voice carrying the weight of untested commitment. Jackson met her eyes, searching for any hint of hesitation. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "I do," he said, and for the first time, he felt the words rooted not in duty, but in truth. He had survived countless winters alone, but none had offered him this. Companionship forged through fire and snow, trust built for necessity and courage, and a quiet hope for what the future might hold. A long pause stretched between them, filled with the sound of distant wind and the soft crunch of snow beneath their boots. Then Nava stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest, just above his heart. Her touch was steady, firm, and her amber eyes bore into his with the intensity of someone who had faced death and chosen life. "You let me sleep in your bed. Rancher, now get ready. We're having children," she said, her tone carrying a mixture of certainty and quiet joy, the statement both shocking and profound. Jackson blinked, caught between disbelief, awe, and an unexpected swell of emotion that he could no longer deny. Her words were not merely a declaration. They were a promise, a claim of shared future, and an assertion that life, no matter how harsh the frontier, continued. He swallowed, feeling a lump rise in his throat. The winter, the losses, the battles, they had all led to this moment. His gaze swept over her face, every scar, every mark of survival telling a story he now shared. He realized then that the frontier's cruelty had taught him more than survival. It had taught him the value of trust, of connection, and the power of embracing life even when it seemed impossible. Jackson reached for her hands, holding them firmly. "Nava, if we survive the winter, if the world allows it, then yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He did not need to finish. She understood. Her smile, small but radiant, lit the cabin brighter than any fire could. They moved inside, their steps careful yet unhurried, aware of the fragile new beginning they were crafting together. Jackson tended the fire while Nava checked the provisions, each engaged in simple tasks that carried profound meaning. Every action was a reaffirmation of life, of trust, of shared purpose. The afternoon faded into evening, and Jackson found a moment to step outside once more. The snow glistened under the sinking sun, painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson. He breathed deeply, tasting the crisp, clean air, feeling the pulse of life that persisted even in the harshest lands. He realized that the frontier was not just a place of hardship. It was a crucible that forged bonds, revealed character, and demanded courage. When he returned inside, Nava was sitting by the fire, her silhouette framed by the dancing flames. She looked up at him, and in that gaze, Jackson saw everything: strength, resilience, trust, and a quiet determination that life, even after its most relentless trials, could be claimed and cherished. They ate in silence, sharing the simple meal, yet the unspoken conversation between them was richer than any words. Jackson felt a sense of completion he had not known since the death of his family. Not happiness in the naive sense, but a profound acknowledgement that survival, love, and hope could coexist, even in the unforgiving frontier. Night fell, and the storm clouds lingered on the horizon, threatening yet distant. Jackson lay beside Nava, careful yet tender, aware of the fragile warmth between them. They had faced death, distrust, and nature's relentless cruelty, and emerged not only alive but irrevocably changed. He realized that their bond was more than survival. It was a partnership, a merging of resilience and hope, and the first step toward a future neither could have imagined alone. As the fire died down to embers, Jackson whispered into the quiet room, "We endure. Together." Nava's hand found his, squeezing gently in reply. The wind howled outside, indifferent and relentless, but within the cabin, a fragile, determined warmth remained. The frontier still loomed outside, a world of danger, uncertainty, and harsh judgment. But Jackson and Nava had carved a sanctuary, small but sacred, where trust and life could flourish. And in that small cabin, amidst the snow and the wilderness, a new chapter began. Not without hardship, not without risk, but with promise. Finally, Jackson rose and looked toward the audience, a quiet strength in his eyes, the weight of the frontier and his journey reflected in every line of his face. "The frontier teaches us," he said softly, "that life is never easy, trust is never given, and love must be fought for, earned, and cherished." He paused, letting the words linger. If their story taught you anything, let it remind you to fight for connection, resilience, and hope. Like, comment, and subscribe to witness more stories of courage and survival. And remember, sometimes the harshest winters bring the brightest dawns.